Hello my dear friends, my name is Essam, and in this series I try to teach you how to work with epoxy resin. The most important thing is your safety and health. When epoxy resin is curing or hardening, it emits harmful gases. That's why you have to work with epoxy resin in a place which is properly ventilated, with a lot of windows or fans to ventilate the air. And keep in mind that normal masks, such as the one we were using during the COVID-19 pandemic, cannot protect you from chemical gases. So if you have to work in a place without windows and proper ventilation, you need proper masks, like a kind of masks that you usually see in chemical warfare. So what do we need to start our journey in making epoxy resin art? Okay, my friends, let's get started. The first thing you need is epoxy resin itself. It doesn't matter what brand you're using. Just try to find the one with the lowest viscosity possible. I tried different brands of epoxy resin, and I come across this one, which as you can see is R725. That one is what I use. Another thing that you have to pay attention to is its expiration date. And also be careful that epoxy resin should be kept in a specific range of temperature. As you can see, this one should be kept between 2 and 40 degrees Celsius. And also you have to keep it away from humidity. And unfortunately, this epoxy resin which I come across is for industrial purpose only, so it's not food safe. And keep in mind that after each use you have to close the lid very carefully. When you buy epoxy resin, you have epoxy resin in one container and you have hardener in another container, which whenever you're making epoxy art, you have to mix them together. Just keep in mind that some epoxy resins are mixed together based on their volume, while the others are mixed based on their weight, so you have to be careful about this one. The usual rate of epoxy resin to hardener is 2:1. For example, if you add 40 grams of epoxy resin, you have to add 20 grams of hardener. The next thing you need is latex gloves. This is to protect your hands from epoxy resin. Next, you need disposable cups. You can use paper cups, which are usually less expensive. But sometimes when you're dealing with these paper cups, there is a chance of leaks from the bottom. If something like that happens, the epoxy which is in the broken cup should be transferred to a next one. But after a while, when the epoxy cures, your broken leaky cup will fix itself and you can use it next time. One advantage that these cups have is that they're cheap, but you can also use the expensive option, which is this hard transparent cups. It is important that your cup is tough so that it wouldn't crumble under the weight of epoxy. And also they have an added bonus: if you drop them, it wouldn't break. When I'm working on my own, I use the normal paper cups. But for recording these series, I'll sometimes use the transparent ones so that you can see what happens when you try to stir epoxy resin with the hardener. But you can work with both of them so that you can see which one works better for you. Either the cheaper normal paper cups or the hardened plastic transparent ones. You also need disposable or plastic spoons. But you can also use plastic forks and plastic knives as well. You can even use chopsticks. You don't need expensive spoons. Just use whatever plastic spoons that you can find. I use the plastic spoons to mix the hardener with the epoxy resin. You can also use them to mix the pigment with the resin itself. If you have only forks and knives at your home, you can use the handles for mixing. But if you have plastic spoons, you can both use it for mixing and also you can use it to grab some of the epoxy to pour it into the mold. But why do I have these plastic spoons in two different sizes? When you're using deeper disposable cups, if your spoon is too short, you can't reach the bottom of your cup and thereby you cannot mix it properly. That's why I prefer the bigger spoons. Although I prefer the thicker handles, but you can use the normal ones because when you use them to mix epoxy resin and then you let them dry, it can also harden the handles of your spoons. To sum up, you need plastic spoons to mix your epoxy resin. Something else that you can use is disposable syringes. Just keep in mind that if you want to throw away the tips, do it in a way that it wouldn't harm anyone. Because normally when working with epoxy resin, you wouldn't need the tips. This is because the tip of the normal syringes is too narrow that you cannot use it to pour viscous liquids such as epoxy resin. And to pour epoxy resin, you need bigger orifices such as this one. On the other hand, if you want to inject alcohol inks into your epoxy resin, you can use the tips to do so. You also need pigments so that your epoxy resin is colorful. The first pigment that I want to introduce to you is neon powder pigment. It doesn't matter what brand you're using, but it's better if it dissolves in the epoxy well. As you can see, neon pigments are a little bit different than normal ones, because under the light, they shine like highlight markers. Let me show you how they look like. As you can see, this kind of powder pigments clump together and as if you have these little balls of powder stick together. So when you want to mix them with epoxy resin, you have to be careful to pop each of those balls so that you won't end up with clumps of undissolved powder. Whenever you want to open or close the lid of these powder pigments, keep in mind that you have to do it away from your projects. Because as you can see, you can end up with a mist of powder on your finished project. As you can see, you can find neon powder pigments in many different colors, but you have to be careful when using them. Although if you use neon pigments, your finished project would look good, but on the other hand, if you put your finished project under the sunlight, it would lose its color. So if you need a pigment which can endure sunlight, use the next pigments. Alcohol inks are another great option for making colorful epoxy resin arts. Just be careful that these pigments are highly flammable and their vapor is harmful for your lungs. The great advantage of alcohol inks is that they're permanent, thereby their color doesn't fade away so easily. And also keep in mind that when you're using alcohol inks, you have to shake it before each use. This is because these pigments can dry. Another advantage of this sort of pigment is that you can inject them using syringes because they are less viscous than epoxy. On the other hand, working with them can be a little messy. As you can see, when I used this particular pigment, it went everywhere and made a big mess. And if I wasn't wearing any gloves, my hands would also look like this. But other than that, these pigments are easy to mix and they don't change color. Mica pearl pigments are another kind of powder pigments. They are usually sold as a fine powder. As you can see, these kind of pigments have a metallic shine, much like a shiny pearl, as the name suggests. You can find these kind of pigments in different sizes, such as this one, and even smaller ones. And as you can see, they come in many different colors. Just be careful that when you're storing them, if you put them upside down, you will end up with a big mess when opening them. And whenever you want to open the lid of powder pigments such as this one, you have to do it away from the project that you are working on. To compare mica pearl with neon powder pigment, you need to know the color of mica pearl pigments are permanent, while the color of neon powder pigments can change over time. Mica pearl pigments are opaque, while neon powder pigments are transparent. I need to mention that mixing mica pearl pigment is much easier than neon powder pigments. We also can use color pastes. As you can see, they have the consistency of a paste. Color pastes too come in many different colors, but when you use them, you have to be careful because some of them are transparent while the others are opaque. So test them before using it in your final project. Also, I need to mention that color pastes give us more homogeneous mixture in comparison to the powder pigments. We also can use metallic powders. For example, I have some gold powder here. Just like mica pearl powder, when you use metallic powders, you have to open their lid away from your final project because usually when you open their lid, they make a big mess. You can find metallic powders in different colors such as silver, gold, brass, and bronze. You have to keep in mind that whenever you use metallic powder, your final project will be shiny like a surface of a metal, and it wouldn't be transparent. We also need digital scale because most of the epoxy resin that we can find is mixed with its hardener based on its weight. Working with these digital scales is very easy. You just put your disposable cup on the scale, set it to 0, then you can add your resin, and after that you can add your hardener based on the rate that the company that made it tells you, which is usually 2:1, meaning that for 1 part of hardener you need 2-part resin. If the epoxy resin that you can find is mixed based on its volume, you can do it with your disposable cups. On the other hand, if it's mixed based on its weight, you have to weigh your resin and your hardener very meticulously. Because if you don't, your final project will either be too brittle or too soft. Also keep in mind that each digital scale has an operational maximum weight. If you want to work on smaller projects, a digital scale such as this one would be enough. When making epoxy resin art, you can also use metal leaves, such as gold leaves. As you can see, metal leaves are a very thin sheet of metal and they are very delicate. This one is a gold leaf. You can also find silver leaves, bronze leaves, and also brass leaves. Just be careful that when you want to buy a gold leaf, they might sell you brass leaves, which look basically the same. You can use the metallic leaves in their original form as a sheets, or you can simply turn them to flakes. Just be careful not to work with metallic leaves in a windy place because they might get blown away. As you can see, they are very delicate and you can tear them very easily. You can easily crumble the metallic leaves and turn them into metallic flakes in a size that you desire. Whenever you try to turn metallic sheets into metallic flakes, such as my gold flakes, be careful that you do it away from your final project so that you don't ruin it. Another thing that we need is a handheld kitchen lighter. Although some of the artists use torches, but I prefer kitchen lighters because epoxy resin is a flammable liquid and controlling the flame that comes out of a torch is much more difficult than a normal kitchen lighter. Whenever you see that there are little bubbles on the surface of your finished project, you can easily pop them by holding the flame on the surface of epoxy resin near those bubbles. Another thing that can help us is forceps. I personally use them whenever I want to grab something and put it inside epoxy resin, and they're very helpful. They're also helpful if you accidentally drop something inside your epoxy resin and you want to take them out of it. We also need a pencil, because sometimes you might need to take notes to remember the formula that you used to finish a project. For example, how many grams of resin and hardener you used, how many grams of pigment you used, etc. But if you use a pen or any other instrument with moving parts and you drop a little bit of epoxy on it, it wouldn't work anymore. That's why the best option to take notes while you're working with epoxy resin is a simple pencil. Another important instrument that we need is level. When you're pouring epoxy resin into the mold, if your surface is slanted, you will end up with slanted finished projects. Thereby, you need a level surface before starting to work with epoxy resin. Just keep in mind that whenever you try to level your surface, you have to do it at least in two directions. This is because your surface might be level at imaginary X direction while it is slanted in Y direction. It doesn't matter what brand or kind of level you're using, as long as your surface is not slanted. Another thing that we need to work with epoxy resin is silicone molds. This is because when epoxy resin hardens, it doesn't stick to silicone. You can buy silicone molds that are specifically made for epoxy resin, like silicone molds for coasters or silicone molds for earrings, etc. On the other hand, you can buy silicone molds that are usually made for chocolate. As you can see, silicone molds are elastic. Elasticity of silicone molds has a great advantage because when your epoxy resin hardens and you want to take it out of the mold, you can push the mold from beneath and your finished project will pop up. Another thing that you can use is Fimo slices. You can find Fimo slices in different sizes and different shapes. For example, here I have some flowers, watermelons, citruses, berries, vegetables, and so on. Just be careful to use Fimo slices with transparent pigments, because if you use opaque pigments, you can't see the Fimo slices inside your epoxy resin. Another important tip that I can give you is to use pillboxes. As you can see, I have used a pillbox to categorize different Fimo slices and also keep them safe and clean. We can also use cotton swabs to form our pigments inside epoxy resin and create beautiful artworks. Last but not least, you need a plastic sheet cover to cover the surface that you're working on. Just keep in mind that you need one of these thick polymer covers so that epoxy resin cannot dissolve it. This one is just to protect the surface that you're working on. If you have a desk or any other surface that you don't care about, you can omit buying a plastic sheet. Now that you know what you need to start working with epoxy resin, on next episode we will start to make epoxy resin art.